بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight. This is, I hope, as my thinking is, it's going to be an exciting night. Or we hope. أي لا واصل مش شغال. Hope that we will learn quite a few from our two guests. Dr. Fahd and Dr. Riyad kindly agreed to host him tonight, and for your benefit and my benefit. Dr. Gregory was here before, and he knows how this formula goes. Dr. Gregory Gause is a professor of international relations,
الشؤون
الدولية at Texas A&M University, and this was after he left Vermont.
University of Vermont.
University of Vermont, how long ago?
19 years. I was there for 19 years. I left 5 years, 6 years ago.
6 years ago to Texas.
For Texas.
Well-versed, well-informed of Saudi affairs, Arab affairs, Middle Eastern affairs in general. And Jasen is a dear friend of Greg. We have not met him before here. We're happy that they both of them were able to make it to Saudi Arabia. They are being sponsored by King Fahd.
King
Faisal Islamic Studies Institute Center.
مركز ملك فيصل للدراسات الإسلامية والبحوث.
Exactly. And we switched this to Arabic. And they were gracious enough to say yes to come and meet with you this evening. Our schedule is we will give each one of them 10, maximum 12 minutes to, and here, just in case you're thinking.
I have mine.
To speak to us on the issues that's on their mind. We try to keep the address of this session open and general so that we can raise different issues and not be bound by a narrow topic. Then we will open the floor for questions and comments, not just questions, but also comments. And I assure you, both gentlemen will be happy to answer your questions, but they will also be happy to hear our opinion. This is very important to them. Greg, 12 minutes.
شكرا جزيلا يا أستاذ. I have known Osama for...
Can you use the microphone, please?
I think I have this one. Yeah, it's okay. I've known Osama for longer than either he or I would probably want to admit. And he's always been very kind in organizing interesting things when I come to Riyadh. I spoke here at Asbar 2 years ago, and I found it extremely interesting, and so I'm very, very happy to be back. Sorry that my Arabic isn't good enough to do this in Arabic, but my guess is all of you speak English much better than I speak Arabic. So I want to take 10 minutes to focus very, very specifically on the events of the last few days. And from there we can expand to talk about broader topics. But to me, the question that I had when the United States killed Qasem Soleimani was why President Trump chose to respond so forcefully to, in essence, the death of one American, an American contractor who was working in Kirkuk with the Iraqi military, when in September of last year, just 4 months ago, after Iran attacked the most important oil facility, not just in Saudi Arabia, but the most important oil facility in the world, in Abqaiq, President Trump did basically nothing. Right? Why an enormous reaction to the death of one American, right? That led to the missile attacks on Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and Syria, which led to the assault on the American embassy, which basically led to the drone attack on General Soleimani. When for decades the United States had said that it was in the Gulf region to protect the free flow of oil. And when the free flow of oil was attacked, the United States basically did nothing. Right? So there's a context to this. And the context, of course, is the tensions and the contradictions in President Trump's policy of maximum pressure toward Iran. Right? President Trump's policy of maximum pressure, right, requires a military presence. But on the other hand, President Trump has said repeatedly that the United States shouldn't be fighting wars in the Middle East. He campaigned on that principle. He's criticized American policy in the Iraq War and in other policies, in other involvements of the United States in the Middle East. So there's this tension in Trump's policy. We want maximum pressure on Iran, but we don't want to fight Iran. And that's kind of the atmosphere in which the killing of Soleimani took place. So what's the difference between what happened in September of 2019, and the US didn't react to it, and the events of the last few days? Well, I think that it reflects a couple of changes in thinking, not just for Trump, but for many people in the American elite. One of those changes is the perception that oil is no longer that important a strategic commodity. I disagree with this view. However, there's a very powerful sentiment that since the United States is now, at least temporarily, energy independent, that the United States doesn't have to worry that much about what happens in the Gulf region. And in fact, President Trump said that. After the attacks on Abqaiq, he said, that's not our oil. We don't need that oil. Let the Japanese take care of this. Right? This is a very different view from the traditional American view of security in this region. I think for President Trump, and this is something particular to him, foreign policy is much more personal and much less institutional. It's much more about individual interests and much less about strategic interests. And so for him, the death of one American, that unfortunate contractor in Kirkuk, strikes him as more important than an attack on Abqaiq. Because his starting point is not strategic interests as much as the way he defines specific American interests, which is you don't attack Americans. I also think that the attack on the embassy in Baghdad triggered in President Trump a memory. But it wasn't the memory that most people who study the Middle East would have had. Right? When I saw the video of the attack on the embassy in Baghdad, the thing I thought about was 1979 and the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran. Right? And what that meant for US-Iranian relations and the crisis that followed that, the effect on Jimmy Carter's presidency, all of those things. That's clearly not what President Trump thought about. What he thought about was the attack on the embassy in Benghazi, in Libya, in 2014. That was an issue that Republicans used as a stick to beat Hillary Clinton, right? To try to mobilize support against her, blame her for that. And you saw President Trump tweet after the attack on the embassy in Baghdad, said, this is the anti-Benghazi. So for him, the attack on the embassy was a direct threat to his reelection. It was a direct, he saw that as an attack on his chance of being reelected. The attack on an individual American and the attack on the embassy were enough to mobilize Trump to put aside his fears of getting involved in another conflict in the Middle East and to directly strike at one of the major figures in the Iranian regime. Right? this is a very different way of thinking about foreign policy than American presidents have used in the past. Now, I think that there's a real risk of escalation from this crisis, because the Iranian impulse will be to match the killing of Soleimani with some high-profile strike on Americans somewhere in the Middle East or even beyond the Middle East. And this is exactly the thing that triggers President Trump. If the Iranians were to respond with, God forbid, another attack on Abqaiq, or another attack on oil tankers, right? Or an attack on Saudi or Gulf interests somewhere, I don't think it would affect Trump that much. But if they respond with an attack on an American embassy or on American personnel or an American base that, again, God forbid, la qadar Allah, kills Americans, then I think that these threats that President Trump has made, irresponsible threats, to bomb 52 sites in Iran and to destroy cultural heritage sites in Iran, might actually happen. Because as I said, I don't think President Trump looks at foreign policy in the same way that past American presidents did. It's much more personal and much less institutional. It's much more about the individual interests of the president and much less about strategic interests of the United States as they've been defined in the past. I don't think that this is good news. I think it's disturbing news, but I think it hopefully will get us thinking about the risks that the Gulf region will face in the next months ahead. And on that very happy note, I'll turn the discussion over to my colleague, Professor Castillo.
Now for something a little bit more depressing. Less uplifting. I am not a student of the Middle East. I'm coming at this problem as someone who's worked in the Pentagon, who studies and has worked on defense planning.
What's the name of your institute in Texas?
I am also the director of our Institute for Grand Strategy, which is going to be the subject of my talk, which is what's the strategic concepts that are driving U.S. foreign policy more broadly, especially as the world has changed in the last 20 years. So Greg gave you a very tight focus on his area of expertise. I'm going to take this to 15,000 feet to give you a bird's eye view of how the United States thinks about its strategic context and where the Middle East fits. And we're going to end up in the same place, which is Iran, Iran, Iran. The bottom line of my talk is the United States faces what I would call long-term issues that are pulling it towards East Asia, but it's constantly pushed in the short term back to the Middle East. And for the United States, it's about balancing the risk of dealing with the rise of China and understanding how to deal with the Middle East, in particular, the possibility and the serious possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran, and what that means for U.S. defense and military policy, and what that means for you as our allies in the Gulf. So I want to look at two things in my brief remarks. First, what's different and same about American foreign policy today? People ascribe many things to President Trump. There are many flavors to his views. There's what he said in 2016 when running for the election, and there's what he actually does. And I'm a big believer that talk is cheap, actions tell you more. And then the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how the Middle East fits. And I'm going to identify the central strategic problem we face, which again is a nuclear-armed Iran, and outline what I think the US will do about it and what this means for Saudi Arabia and other states in the Gulf. So let me first talk about what's different and what's the same. What's different is Twitter. What's different is the rhetoric. In some ways, in 2016, it was refreshing because Donald Trump was raising issues that were sacred in the United States. You could never challenge the American presence in Europe. You could never assume that Japan and South Korea would acquire nuclear weapons and question whether or not that was good or bad. Axiomatically, that was always bad. You could never poke at the core interests of US national security and question whether or not we should be in these places. You could never question the conventional wisdom about where the United States should expend blood and treasure. But after 17, 18 years in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and the crisis in Syria, the American public was ready for the conversation of, this is not working. So what's different is the rhetoric. The rhetoric has been very different. Now, what's been the same? I would submit to you that the aims, the objectives of American foreign policy remain the same. There are many things we say we want to do in the world. Our national security documents are very long, right? Entire forests have been destroyed on all of our ambitions. But if you were to boil down what our ambitions are, I think there are three. Number one, we want to maintain our military primacy. We want to be the most important military dominant actor in every region. We do not want to allow countries like China or Russia or Iran to have the same advantages that we do, which is we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And by dominating the Western Hemisphere, we are very safe in our own neighborhood. And that allows us the freedom to roam in places like Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. So our primary objective, which has always been the same since the end of the Cold War, is military primacy. And of course, oil is important to that, because our potential peer competitors like China need access to resources like oil to grow. And we know that economic growth is the engine to fuel military growth. So oil, especially oil from the Persian Gulf, is important to this objective of primacy. The second objective we have, which is the same, is we want to stop new nuclear competitors. All you have to do is see how we react to North Korea. Whether you're President Obama, Bush, or Trump, no one is excited by a nuclear-armed North Korea because it twists us in knots and constrains our ability to coerce countries like that. Third, we talk about installing the liberal international order, which is basically code word for the rules and institutions that grease the skids of the current order. These are all the same objectives that Papa Bush had when he was president, when his son was president, when Barack Obama was president, and I would submit to you Donald Trump as president. Different rhetoric, same objectives. What else is different? Something that's different is the means. Donald Trump does not look like Barack Obama. And many of you are happy about that because you thought that Barack Obama was abandoning the Middle East and was abandoning his allies in the Gulf. Trump is different in that respect. Trump has embraced the Gulf states. Trump agrees with you about Iran. Trump's applying maximum pressure on Iran. What's also different from Barack Obama is that Trump looks a lot like President Bush 43. I can say that. I worked for President Bush 43. Some of the hallmarks of that relationship between Bush and its allies was that the Bush 43 presidency thought allies sometimes didn't really understand their core interests.
43 is W.
W.
Yeah.
The son.
The son, the younger Bush. The younger Bush's administration believed in the unilateral use of force and the application of force. They talked about regime change. Notice when you hear President Trump talk about Iran, he talks about maximum pressure. Sometimes it's about regime change, sometimes it's not. But it is about the unilateral use of American military power to achieve its objectives. One issue that is the same across these last presidencies since the end of the Cold War is that we are balancing two sets of risk. The rise of China is on the horizon. China has an enormous economy. China is a customer of yours. China is a potential patron of yours. China is definitely a peer competitor of the United States. The one key difference is that China has yet to translate its wealth into military power. China cannot project military power like the United States can. China lacks a blue water navy, but China is not going to depend on the United States Navy to protect its access to oil and other resources internationally. So in our view, and the view of many people in defense circles in the United States, the primary problem that is down the road is the rise of China. Think of it this way. The Chinese economy is approaching, or sometimes surpassing by some measures, the American economy. But where we beat them is in per capita GDP. If the Chinese were to acquire the same per capita GDP as the United States, that would become a geostrategic nightmare. That's the thing that keeps me up at night, is if China becomes that kind of a competitor, it's going to be more dangerous than the Soviet Union. And we have to balance that against other short-term threats. I'll give you two examples that preoccupy us. North Korea, which I already mentioned in East Asia, and a second example is what is Russia doing in Eastern Europe? Something that's different in this administration is arming Ukraine. This administration has developed a US strategic nuclear policy to deal with the threat of Russia in Eastern Europe. This administration is taking Russia seriously as a national security threat. So where does the Middle East fit in all of this? Remember, I told you we've had these three objectives: primacy, stopping nuclear competitors, and promoting the liberal international order. When I look at the Middle East, when I ask where does the Middle East fit, I say the central concern we have is a nuclear-armed Iran. We want to prevent that. Why would this be bad for the United States? Why would it be bad for you? Let me lay out what the worst-case scenario is and the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is that Iran develops nuclear weapons, and Iran uses nuclear weapons as a shield to do what it's doing already today. That is promoting instability in other countries, exporting non-state actors, using proxies. Nuclear weapons then become this shield against US conventional military might. They're the thing that deters us from unleashing our conventional superiority. If we were to ask Saddam Hussein, do you wish you had nuclear weapons in 2003? He would say yes. And North Korea understands this, and Iran understands this. So the worst case scenario for us is that Iran becomes like Pakistan. When Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons in 1998, it stepped up its support for terrorism, both in Afghanistan and against India. And our fear that Iran, armed with Hezbollah, will step up its support for terrorism, and we will be hamstrung by its nuclear weapons. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that Iran acquires nuclear weapons, and Iran is less secure, or more secure. And because Iran is more secure, it does less to destabilize the region. In addition, because Iran has nuclear weapons and other actors like the United States have nuclear weapons, the presence of nuclear weapons actually act as a force for stability, because everyone will be more cautious in their behavior. Again, I could point to South Asia for evidence of that kind of behavior. So what does this mean for our allies in the region? You have to understand the US is thinking about how to avoid this problem, right? The Obama solution was an agreement. Well, that agreement is gone. Where does that leave us? Containment, the containment policy that we basically have followed into with North Korea, the one we used to beat the Soviet Union. I'm hoping that means 3 minutes. And regime change. But ask yourself this question.
Actually, 4.
4 minutes. Oh, that's an eternity. Ask yourself, what does regime change mean? What does it look like? So the one obvious form of a regime change we're not going to do, which is invade Iran and send the 3rd Infantry Division to Tehran like we did to Baghdad. We're not going to do that, right? We've seen what that looks like in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria we didn't do, but we basically said Assad should go. And all these examples were really bad for us, so we're not going to do that. So what does maximum pressure mean as a form of regime change? How would that happen? Have you been thinking about that? I've been thinking about that in the last few days. And I think the best story that American policymakers are telling themselves is that with maximum pressure, the Iranian economy will be under such pressure that, like the Soviet Union, they'll find a reformer, a Gorbachev, who will say enough is enough, right? That we have to stop this because our people are suffering and there might be an internal revolt. And through that process of reform, the regime makes changes. There's probably a variant of this story, which is the Iranian Gorbachev makes changes that are too quick, and that's when the regime unravels, right? Now, my basic view is that we're heading towards a policy of containment. We're not going to do regime change. I think maximum pressure is leading regime change is more based on luck than anything else. And the possibility of an agreement seems to have been buried with the death of the leader of the IRGC. What should you be worried about? I think you need to worry about two questions. First is, what does deterrence require? If I'm right that Iran is headed towards nuclear weapons and we're going to pursue a policy of containment, what should Saudi Arabia do? Well, you have to try to figure out what is required for deterrence. Do you have the right conventional capabilities to deal with Iran? Do nuclear weapons solve the problems that you face against Iran? From my view, you have two problems that Iran poses for you. Internal insurrection in your neighbors, and even possibly in Saudi Arabia itself. But more directly, you're worried about a campaign or a missile war with Iran, a campaign of coercion where they hold you at risk. And you could develop the conventional capabilities to deal with that, your own missiles or missile defense. You also have to ask yourself, how reliable is the United States as an ally? Which is a very difficult question, right? And as an American, I have to be honest with you. Trump is your friend today, but he is a very short-term thinker, right? And it's not clear to me that he's thought these problems through clearly. And if I had to bet my mortgage, I would say that the experience you had with Barack Obama will be more typical than atypical. That is American presidents understanding that yes, the Middle East is important, yes, Iran is important, but I have to keep my powder dry to deal with China, balancing those long-term risks with the short-term problems of the Middle East. I'm not here to tell you that we're abandoning the Gulf, but the days of President George W. Bush the younger are over, right? And Obama tried to shift the burden to get you to do more, and future American presidents will probably do that. They will want you to put more skin in the game, to buy more conventional capabilities, to do more to protect yourselves. So the bottom line here, just as an outsider, as someone who just thinks about American foreign policy more generally, we have got long-term problems. We have to get our own house in order to deal with the rise of China. That's a very serious economic and military threat. China's not 16 feet tall now. They're about 5 feet tall. But they're going to go through a growth spurt, and they're going to be very dangerous for us. And that long-term problem means we're going to put more burden on the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia to deal with the near-term problem, which is a nuclear-armed Iran. And that's a very serious, dangerous threat. But strategy is about balancing risk and opportunities. And there's an art to this. And you're going to see some consistency in American administrations, but I'm not sure I would trust that the United States will always do what you think is best in your interests.
Professor Castillo, Professor Gause, thank you very much. That was great. I have about 25 questions.
And we have about 25 minutes, so that's a minute a question.
25 people.
I will start with the audience here who may have any questions or even opinions. Then I will start.
Nobody wants to start?
I will go ahead, Simon.
Thank you very much. Jason, you have given me 25,000 feet. But every time I hear any American politician or strategist speak about the Middle East or analyzing the whole picture,
1 minute per question.
they miss one element out of all the analysis. That is Israel.
That's all.
That is Israel. Where do you see Israel in this dilemma? We see a trend, a social trend here, calling Iran the only enemy, which is not true. Actually, we don't want enemies. We don't even want Israel as an enemy. But it's never cross-checked in any challenge, in any analysis. The presence of Israel, and especially with the amount that they got in Trump's administration, has really ignited a huge hatred against the United States and against the United States allies, so-called Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. That actually escalated the excuse on the Iranian side of escalating their activities, so-called anti-Israel, even with Qasem Soleimani calling himself the Quds coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Where is Israel from all this challenges? A sincere opinion, please.
I think we should both answer that quickly, but let me give you my quick answer, which is
Ellen. Okay, we'll do that. We'll take
Okay,
three
sure,
more questions
sure.
and then- okay, who's next? Nobody, I will go. تفضلي دكتورة فوزية.
Of course, I think what you say is very scary for us. You just remind us of things that we don't want to hear. I think, the most important thing is to remember that we have to actually arrange our, inside the houses, and we just have to know how to figure all this out. You talked about the dreams of the Americans about the internal reforms inside Iran. Is that, of course, it's not going to be just a dream. I'm sure there is information. Is that possible? Is it, like something we would hope that it happened and that the regime itself would change itself from inside? Is this a real possibility that we could hope for, or just a dream?
Okay, next, please.
Thank you very much for your opinions and talks. I want to ask, where do you see China, and would you expect China to cooperate with the US, especially with their Belt Road that will pass through the region, Iraq, Iran? Do you think China and the US will cooperate to stabilize the region in the future?
Anybody else?
Yes, thank you very much. My question is, what's the role of Turkey in what's going on or in the future? Thank you.
4 questions. Jason?
Israel. So I have tenure, so I can talk about Israel with great freedom. Israel is a blessing and a curse for the United States, right? We have, for domestic reasons, we have strong ties to Israel, right? For domestic political reasons. But if I just think about this in a cold, calculating, strategic way, Israel poses problems for the United States, right? Its treatment of the Palestinians. It's an ally that sometimes does things that we don't want them to do. When I teach international relations, like Greg does, we talk about Glenn Snyder's paradox the allies face, which is abandonment and entrapment. And so we worry that Israel will entrap us in conflicts that we don't want to fight. Now, just to tie the Turkey and Israel questions together, just thinking about this again in cold, calculating ways, Iran is your primary geostrategic threat, and Turkey and Israel both worry about Iran. If you believe in balance of power politics, what is the old saying? My enemy's enemy is my friend. So military-to-military cooperation is not such a bad idea. And Israel is actually very formidable in terms of conventional military power, and they have nuclear weapons. On Iran internal reforms, is it a dream? Let me answer this way. I always tell my students that the Cold War could still be going on if Yuri Andropov had 2 healthy kidneys, right? So we're lucky that we got Gorbachev.
Yeah.
So the question we have to ask ourselves, who is the Gorbachev inside the Iranian regime? And I don't study Iranian politics, but my view of the Cold War is that was very lucky that we got Gorbachev, because we could have gotten Ligachev, who was also in the Politburo and who was even more of a hardliner than Andropov. And on China, is there a possibility of cooperation? Yes, if you write editorials in the New York Times like Tom Friedman, but no, if you look at history. The rise of great powers and competitors are very competitive and very violent. And I think the United States and China are going to compete over places like the Middle East.
I worry about Turkey turning into another Iran. If you look closely at what Turkey is doing, they may be turning into another Iran.
I should make my first trip to Istanbul soon.
Right.
I agree with Jason that the issue of Israel is primarily a domestic political issue in the United States. I think that you could make the case during the latter parts of the Cold War that Israel was a strategic asset when it defeated a Soviet ally in Abdel Nasser's Egypt, when it basically contained a Soviet ally in Hafez al-Assad's Syria. That's a very Cold War view of things. I think it's much more complicated on the ground, but that's the way many Americans looked at the situation. But with the end of the Cold War, it's hard to argue that Israel is a strategic asset to the United States. But that relationship is going to be central to American policy in the Middle East because Israel has a very strong constituency in the United States. And that constituency, I should say, in my opinion, is less and less about American Jews and more about American evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who have a very, very unnuanced view of Israel's role in American foreign policy. I've found over the years that I can have extremely sophisticated conversations with American Jewish audiences about Israel, about the Middle East, about Israeli politics. Very sophisticated and a whole range of views represented. If you talk to fundamentalist and evangelical Christian groups, you cannot have that conversation. And fundamentalist and evangelical Christians are an extremely important part of the Republican Party's political base. One more minute. I'm not going to talk about Turkey. I think Turkey's role in the region is incredibly interesting. I don't know if it's sustainable, and I don't know if it lasts beyond President Erdogan, who has a vision of Turkey's return to the Middle East in almost an Ottoman framework. I'm not sure that that is a generally popular view in Turkey itself, but we'll see. Internal reforms in Iran, yeah, I think they're possible. They're not possible under this supreme leader. As long as Ayatollah Khamenei is Wali al-Faqih, I believe he has very fixed views about the United States, very fixed views about the region, and very fixed views about how politics should run in Iran. But this is a very top-down regime. And a change at the top, much like the Soviet Union, was a very top-down regime. A change of the top person, which will happen sometime, right, could lead to very interesting changes. But it also could lead to even more severe changes. China, I think, I'm not as pessimistic as Jason is in the short term. I think he's absolutely right. The lessons of history as one reads it is that great powers are always going to see each other as competitors. But Jason made the very important point that China is not a great power right now. It's a regional power. Right? It's a growing economic power. Right? But it's not a global military and political power. And while that is the case, China's interests in the Gulf region are not dissimilar from America's interests. That is to say, the free flow of oil. And so I think that the Chinese, very much in the short term, next 5 years, will not be challenging the United States, and also will see their major interest as maintaining stability for the flow of oil, which sometimes America helps do and sometimes America does not, right? We have to remember, and I'll just take one more minute on this because I think it's important for us to keep this in mind. The most disruptive force in the world oil market in the past 25 years has been the United States. We have, well, not just our own production. We put sanctions on Iran so Iran can't sell its oil to the market. We put sanctions on Gaddafi's Libya. We put sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Right? We invaded Iraq, right? And basically took its oil off the market for years. Right? The United States, in its actions in the Middle East, has and not even the Middle East, we have sanctions on Venezuela to try to keep Venezuelan oil off the market. And so the United States, right, although it says it wants the free flow of oil from the Gulf region, and I think it basically does, has also been probably the most disruptive force in the world oil market, politically and because of its own production in the last 2 decades. So we should keep that in mind too.
Very interesting. I have a question to you, a comment to you, and a question to Jason. I appreciate and understand your what is it? Microphone.
No.
Okay.
There is one for.
I appreciate your assessment of Trump's thinking, personal versus institutional. But I think it may have little to do with the killing of Soleimani, because the events that led to that killing are so difficult for America not to move. There were a few, I don't want to take time listing these events, but these are a list of events, including, of course, the downing of the drone and the attack on the ships. And, if America didn't move, America would have lost face. So maybe I appreciate your separation of these two things, but I think it may have less to do with the killing of Soleimani. And to you were talking about, Jason, about the liberal international order. But the conservative Christians were the basic structure of America's government for many years. So how can you reconcile the two? We'll hear one question from Dr. Riyad.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's compare the scene here in our region over the past 20 years. Let's say in 2000, how much influential was Iran over the region, and how much influential it is now. Now, there is some theory that says that this has to do partly with the American policy in the Middle East, because this did coincide with the invasion of Iraq. Now, unfortunately, this is what we are trying to prevent, which is the continuous influence of Iran over basically 4 Arab states. We're talking about Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. Now, what did cause this increase in influence? Is it just the American policy, or is it the lack of reaction from the different regimes in the region? What is it? Because this is what we are trying to fight now, and it looks like it's going to be very difficult.
Fourth question. Turkey, and then Biden into the Knesset. Turkey, please.
Thank you. It's
1 minute, please.
well, good. You talked about Bush. The son was a very good friend of us. He is the one who decided to overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia and 7 other governments. You talked about Iran. Iran is the major threat, and we all got to go with Iran and Iran. I personally think Iran is nothing but a nice tools for milking the money out of Saudi Arabia and the GCC. What we really need to do, the subject we need to talk the least about, that's the one we talk the most about. What we need here is we have poverty, we have inequalities, we have lack of sustainability, we have 500 million Arabs, 70% of them are young, and they all going into a dead hole. That's really our atomic bombs, which is going. We all keep talking about Iran. Americans love to talk about bombs and, atomic bombs and all these nice,
like
nice talk.
powers.
And then you gather everybody and they talk like siyasat al-qati', like the crowd move. Let's talk about Iran. Iran, I think, posed a major challenge to Saudi Arabia, but definitely it's not a threat. I think the US have more threat for Saudi Arabia. Who want to take Mecca and Medina out of Saudi Arabia? It's the US. Who want to take the oil field out of Saudi Arabia? It's the US. Is that a talk? No, it's a plan. It's been adopted, which is they called kharitat al-dam, the blood maps. So I am really, I hear that all the time about Iran, Iran, Iran. But is that really our major threat? Or it's nothing but a nice way of milking the Saudi money? Thank you.
And so you now have 4 questions. I'll give you 2 minutes each, and then we have 2 questions, and we'll answer them, and then we have to finish.
Can I just,
You have 2 minutes.
I want to go to this question first.
Okay.
This may surprise you, so I hope you're holding close onto your seat. But let me reinterpret your question slightly, which is, how big of a threat is Iran really?
No, it's not a threat at all. It's a challenge.
Turkey, please let him finish.
Well, he was asking me.
Yeah.
He wasn't expecting it.
It's a teaching device. My own views about American grand strategy is that we can do much less. My own views about American grand strategy is that we have used the military instrument too much, that it's a blunt instrument, that the United States is a very safe country. We have Canada and Mexico are our neighbors, and then to the east and west we have fish and fish. We have lots of nuclear weapons. We have a very good Navy that commands the commons and the seas. So if I hear you correctly, and this is very controversial, which is why I like it, America could come home from the Middle East.
They need somebody to support the printing of their dollars, and they need the better oil. I need to get the water.
All right, that's convenient. Okay, on the liberal international order defined, I should be clear. I think the liberal international order is the spread of democracy, the spread of economic interdependence, and the spread of international institutions. What it has to do with Christianity, we have in God we trust on our dollar bill, but beyond that, I don't. That's the liberal international order is very specific. And then we had a question about, assessing Iranian influence. Who asked that question?
That's me.
Dr. Riyad.
Yeah. That's a really hard thing to measure, right? But the more I talk to Greg, the more I think
it's
that...
very obvious they're not in front of us.
Yeah, well, part of it, we helped make the Persian Gulf Persian by invading Iraq in 2003.
Okay.
So we set up that condition, right? More reasons for us to go home. But it's also plausible to say that Iran is overstretched in what it can get from these proxies, right? Has it been beneficial? Before the assassination of Suleiman, right, you had people protesting in Iran, people wondering, what are we spending our money for with Hezbollah and some of these proxies? So yes, it's working, yes, it's influential, but in a great American tradition, Iran has overstretched itself too. And that's not unusual for great powers.
I think there's a connection between Dr. Turki's point and Dr. Riyad's point, right? The reason some people in the region see Iran as a threat is because Iranian influence does not spread through missiles, right? It does not spread through armed invasion. No one, I think, really fears that the Iranian army is going to march into Riyadh or march into Dammam and take over the oil fields. I don't think anybody really thinks that that's going to happen, right? The reason that Iranian influence spreads is because of the collapse of order in so many Arab states, right? Sometimes that collapse of order is caused by outsiders like us when we go in and destroy the Iraqi state, right? We didn't just invade Iraq, we destroyed the state. We destroyed the state as a choice, as a matter of policy, because we thought we could rebuild a beautiful state in Baghdad that would look just like America.
Yeah.
This was foolish, but that's what we thought we could do, right? Right? Iran's influence spreads because in divided societies, societies that are not providing sustainability, jobs, hope for their people, and governments collapse, as they have in Syria and Yemen and Lebanon ages ago. The Iranians are very skillful at developing allies and proxies and supporters in those societies, and they support them in the fights that they have. Right? The problem is that the Iranians are very skillful at this, and Saudi Arabia is not skillful at this. Right? Saudi Arabia has money, much more money than Iran. But you can't buy people. You can only rent people. You can't buy people. Iran has two things that Saudi Arabia does not have. It has its own forces that it can use, small, right, but effective, to go into countries and support their allies. That's the Quds Force. And second and more important, they have loyal proxies and allies who want to support Iran because they have an ideological connection to Iran.
That's right.
Hezbollah wants to be Iran's ally. The Houthis begged to be Iran's ally. My soundbite on this is that the Houthis wanted to be Iran's ally more than the Iranians wanted to be the patrons of the Houthis. Right? There are groups in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen who carry out the goals of Iran within their own societies. And so Iranian influence in these places is not as expensive as it might be otherwise. The problem for Saudi Arabia, last sentence, is that the natural ideological allies of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East hate Saudi Arabia and want to kill Saudis.
Two questions. Last two questions.
It's a lightning round. You have to be
I
fast.
know, you got to be fast.
You have to be
You have a
fast.
question, Fawzia? Three questions. Four questions. معلش يا دكتور.
Every comment is a question.
Last
Just at the
four
end you
questions.
say, what do you think?
Four questions. شغال.
Okay. I may take...
1 minute per question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, my question is in three parts. And they are
So that's three
related.
questions.
No. It's in three parts, but they are related. And I'll take away, going away from Iran, going back to the United States, the socio-political order, but they have something to do with it. The one thing is that when you said that the American policy in Iraq was foolish to think that they can build, I'm asking is, where are the think
لا لا لا
tanks?
خليك مو شغال هذا؟
هذا مشغل تأكد.
I don't know.
زي من فمك.
Okay. Where are the think tanks that they are specialized in the Middle East regions? Don't they give some kind of informed decisions for the U.S. government? And I'm really surprised that the U.S. will come to these foolish things. The second thing that when you said about the U.S. policy or U.S. relations with Israel, you are going back to the Israeli lobby in the United States. I think after 1979, after the revolution in Iran, many Iranian people, they immigrated, hundreds of thousands in the U.S. And there are talks now that they are trying, with the help, with the big from the Iranian government, to build some kind of a lobby. And it's how much is it influential in the United States. My last one is about Trump. We were, and like everybody in the world, surprised with the rise of Trump. But I think Trump is just like the iceberg. Mm-hmm. There are social changes in the United States. I lived, like many of my friends here in the United States, in the 80s, and we lived in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. But now when I go to the United States and visit California, Texas, I see that the whites are now the minority, and this is maybe Trump is embodying the reflection or the reaction to these changes. Thank you.
Not really.
It was clever,
بعدين
though.
دكتور فوزية وبعدين مهندس خالد.
I would like to ask you about defense strategy for the USA toward NATO, in a way to comfort the growth of Russia military We see many actions in Ukraine and this, and then they are going up. Now, the relation between US and Turkey is going even bad because of the Syria field mainly. They bought S-400. President Trump, by law, he should apply some sanction. He did not do. Turkey is threatening that we will remove the American soldiers from Angerlik and other bases. How you see the relation with NATO, and how getting worse relation with Turkey will affect NATO as well? So it will benefit the Russia growth.
I'll give you 2 minutes each.
I have 2 questions. No, just very quick, really. I mean, Russia is as we know, it's a strong country. I mean, you know, it's a powerful. So, where does Russia actually stand in this mess in the Middle East? I mean, because I don't think, you know, we would have to think. And second question is, what do you think the immediate threat to Saudi Arabia in the short term from the killing of yeah.
And Khalid? then نبغى كلمتين يا دكتور فهد. رياض.
Excuse me, I have to go back to Israel. Not because I want to be controversial here, but because nobody answered. 30 seconds. Nobody answered the question really, because your justification is actually in line with our knowledge about the local domestic influence in the United States. But what happened in Trump's administration is an escalation of support, moving the capital to Jerusalem and all kinds of support that's actually ignited a higher level of confrontation on this level. On the go-home theory, I don't think it's a go-home theory. I think it's a mission not accomplished theory. And I only hope that Tom Hanks did the Charlie Wilson's war movie before 2003. Maybe they did a better job in Iraq.
2 minutes, Jason.
So on the Israel issue, I don't know what else I could say other than it's domestic, but it's really domestic for us, right? I mean, if you asked me to put my monocle in and look at the map clearly, I would say Israel is a problem for us, right?
NATO?
On NATO and Turkey, NATO's core problem is that people don't agree on what's threatening. So if you're in Eastern Europe, you see it as Russia. If you're in Germany, you see it as climate change and you buy a lot of Russian natural gas. And if you're in Western Europe, like France, you think it's terrorism, right? So because the threat is so low, the cohesion in the alliance is also low. And that's why Russia, I think, can play on the peripheries, kind of in a Hezbollah way, in like Ukraine and potentially in the Baltics. Russia in the Middle East, why is Russia there? Probably 3 reasons, and I'm stealing from Greg here. This is a prestige project, right? Their only ally in the region, really. They want to demonstrate they can project power, but this is a country that sails an aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean. It has to fly its planes off the carrier and land it on ground and then use them from the ground. They can't do carrier operations. And this is also about dealing with Islamic terrorism. And Putin wants to show for domestic reasons that he's good at dealing with that problem. The number 1 threat to Saudi Arabia after the assassination, I would be worried about a missile campaign against your water desalination and your oil plants, because that's really hard to deal with. What I think Iran will do, because they don't want this to escalate, is attack US military bases or throw some mines into the Gulf and to hurt us militarily, because I don't think they want to spread this conflict, but I could be wrong.
Where are the think tanks?
Oh, that's a good question.
There's just there's too many think tanks. They cancel each other out. There is so much noise in Washington, and this brings me to the point about Israel, and Trump takes this to a higher level. It's exactly the thing I talked about, which is that he is not a product of the institutions of American foreign policy. He sees foreign policy in a very personal way. Every American president for the last 5, I think, has campaigned saying, I will move the capital, I will move the embassy to Jerusalem. They didn't do it because they went in and the State Department said, look, there's bad consequences of this. The Defense Department said, look, we have important relations in the Arab and Muslim worlds, don't do this. And Bill Clinton George W. Bush, Barack Obama all said, okay, we won't do it. Donald Trump doesn't care about that. The people who vote for him want this.
Yeah.
And so he did it. I won't speak about NATO because Jason just knows so much more about this than I do. But I will speak a little bit about the threat, Dr. Fawzia's question, about the threat from Iran. It seems to me that the Iranians, from the maximum pressure campaign, decided in the middle of 2019 that they had no hope with the Europeans. And what they had to do was create a crisis. To create a crisis to bring world attention to this American campaign and try to get some negotiation started. Not one-on-one with America, but broadly. Bring in the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, right? And in order to do this, they tried to attack the free flow of oil, right? They did it through the mining, they did it to some extent shooting down the drone, and they did it most definitely with the attack on Abu Qeib. And nothing happened. There was no negotiation, there was no international effort to push the United States to have a different policy toward Iran. I think the biggest threat to Saudi Arabia is that at some point the Iranians might decide that they have to do that again if they're going to get people to pay attention to them. I don't think it will be in response to Soleimani. I think the response to Soleimani is going to be directly, as Jason said, it's going to be directly against some American facility. I don't think it will be here. Right? It could be in Iraq, could be in Bahrain, could be in Kuwait.
Could be in Europe.
Could be in Europe.
Well, they
Could be
claim-
in South America.
They claim they want to bomb Israel.
The Israelis take care of themselves,
Yeah.
right? The Israelis take care of themselves. Finally, Doctor, I think that your point about Trump as a symbol of social change is absolutely right. It doesn't say a lot of good things about America, but there are profound social and demographic changes happening in America. The election of Barack Obama was, in my view, a very positive signal of those changes. But there were people, and it's not a majority, but it's a substantial number of people who found that a very negative change. And there is worry about that. I think that I'm somewhat more optimistic. I think that the social trends in the United States on that ground, in terms of social change, are relatively positive. But social change doesn't happen without bumps, right? America is we're very proud now of the changes that we've had in race relations in the United States. But if you think back to the 1950s and 1960s, there was a lot of violence that accompanied that. Violence against African Americans, riots in cities, right? And the social changes we're going through now, you're right, I think Trump is a manifestation of that. I don't think it affects foreign policy that much.
I just want to say that to tie these two comments together, part of that iceberg is that there are a lot of Americans on the left and the right who want to do much less in the world. And remember, Trump said in 2016, enough is enough, right? And that's the danger for American allies, is that iceberg, right? Because there are currents both on the left and the right on this argument.
The trouble with that is it might cause another Pearl Harbor to make the Americans get engaged. Closing remarks, Dr. Riyad, please.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Asbar Group, which is the Asbar World Forum, the Asbar Forum, and the Asbar Center for Studies and Media Studies, I would like to thank you. Professor Greg Gause, Professor Castello, for this very interesting discussion. Maybe just to mention about think tanks. Asbar, we are trying to be a think tank one of the think tanks in Saudi Arabia. We are very proud to be part of the think tanks that will participate in the T20, which is part of one of the engagement groups for the G20, which is going to take place this year in Saudi Arabia. And hopefully that we can make a change to introduce this concept of think tanks in Saudi Arabia. In the United States, there are 2,700, I think, think
Probably.
tanks. In Saudi Arabia, there are 7 or 8
Right.
only.
Right.
So
That's better.
hopefully we can, hopefully, and in Israel there is 150.
Yeah.
In Iran there is 150. So I think we are lacking behind in this concept, and we really ought to work much more on this part of educating our audience, whether it's the intellectuals or the normal people.
Right.
That things have to be discussed on a more broad and level, intellectual level, and even on the social and on the popular level, because we can't afford to be left behind.
Right.
We have to discuss all our ambitions and our threats at the same time. Thank you very much again,
Thank you.
and hopefully that we can have something similar later on during this year and next year.
I look forward
Thank
to
you
that.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.